Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to share with you some of the thoughts that I've had over the years. As you've heard, I've done a lot of work looking at the relationship between spirituality and the human brain, but of course spirituality and morality often come together in both positive as well as negative ways. And what I really wanted to share with you are some of my thoughts today about where morality may arise from the different functions of the mind and brain, and I very much appreciate Dr. Giordano's kind of leaving that idea up in the air, that when I start to talk a little bit about some of the processes in the brain, sometimes we can actually identify where they are coming from or where those different areas of the brain are activated on functional brain imaging studies, for example. But we also can think, we've all had the ability to think about things in certain ways using various cognitive and emotional processes. So I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more euphemistic in terms of being able to think about the ways in which these different processes come together. One of the things that I've also come to realize over the years is that one of the most important elements of the experiences that people have that they engage in through religious rituals, practices like meditation and prayer, for example, is a feeling of connectedness, a feeling of inclusivity, that they are included in the world, they are included in God's plan or in God's world. And sometimes if the religion is taken out of it, it can simply be a sense of connectedness with the universe, with the rest of humanity, with our family. So there are lots of different degrees to which we have this feeling of inclusivity. And I wanted to explore with you today some of the ways in which we think about morality, the ways in which the different emotions and feelings that we experience may have an impact on our perspectives of morality, and then talk a little bit about this idea about the relationship between inclusivity and exclusivity, especially as Dr. Pfaff was talking about the ideas about aggression versus non-aggression, and how those are all mediated together by the brain, also by religious and spiritual practices and ideas and doctrines, and try eventually to relate all of this back to the brain and the mind and the ways in which we work, with the ultimate goal, as I think this is really the goal of this entire conference, is how do we start to translate this into something practical? Is there something that neuroscience can help us to understand that may point us in a direction that would be valuable to help engender feelings of compassion, for example, feelings of inclusivity, feelings of connectedness with all people, and is that a way in which we can actually head ourselves towards some kind of universal morality? So I do want to just take a few moments to talk a little bit about some of the different ways in which our brain functions. Obviously, I'm going to target this a little bit more for the general audience, so I apologize to some degree to people who have a very strong neuroscience background. But I think all of us can relate to these different ways of processing information. And again, as I mentioned, there are many, over the last decade or two, there have been many hundreds or thousands of brain scan studies that have done to look at where all of these different processes occur and to really break them down into their very elemental details. So if I'm talking about here causal processing, well, there's lots of different ways in which we can process causality in the world. But I think when we look at the larger question of where morality is coming from within our own minds and how we begin to perceive it, I think we can't really deny the fact that causality has a very important and essential aspect to how we think about morality. We need causality. We need our brain to be able to wrap itself around causal phenomenon in order to begin to think about what morality is. Because after all, we have to ask a question, is a particular thought or action moral? Is it ethical? And part of what we need to figure out in that context is the causal line of sequences that arise from that particular thought or behavior. So if I just swing my fist and I don't hit anybody, we can ask whether that was a moral behavior. But obviously, if it caused somebody to get hit and fall down and be in pain, then that may be immoral. So we think in terms of causality and causal sequences, and we need this ability if we are going to think about our ethics and moral behaviors. And similarly, I think the cause and effect ability of our brain to look at the world becomes extraordinarily important when we consider the idea of free will. And this is something that cognitive neuroscience has taken a very strong look at, and clearly philosophy over the centuries has looked at, do we have free will? And part of that becomes a causal question. Are we actually responsible for causing the things that we do? And as we were just hearing about from Dr. Pfaff, how much do our genetics impel us to act in certain ways, in which case maybe we do not have the same kind of free will that we would like to think that we have? How much does our environment influence us? But of course, all of us have a presumption, I think, that we do have free will. And again, there's some really fascinating issues, I think, that come up when we think about how our causal processes in the brain enable us to think about our world, our environment, and how we have an impact on that environment to decide whether or not we actually have free will and whether our actions then, on the basis of that free will, can be valued or viewed as being moral or immoral. Now, you heard Dr. Pfaff talk about our neocortex. Well, the neocortex obviously is extraordinarily unique among human beings relative to all other animal species. We have tremendous capabilities of abstract thought. And what I mean by abstract thought is really the ability to think in terms of symbols and language, and we'll hear some more later on about the ways in which we do engage those particular processes, the ability to categorize things, the ability to actually think about what morality is. So we can actually pose these questions in our mind. We can think about how we understand a particular moral question. When Dr. Pfaff talked about the prisoner's dilemma, that's something that we can all think about. We can all begin to try to figure out, would we cooperate? Would we defect? How do we handle that particular situation? And we can hold various thoughts and ideas that we may have about what really is the right thing to do, regardless of what the actual number outcomes might be, and what would compel us to act in one way or another. So this enables us to hold various ideas and to begin to think about moral, philosophical, religious, and spiritual issues that we can begin to manipulate and try to understand in various ways within our mind. Now, our brain also has a very interesting, what I sometimes refer to as a binary process. I guess the classic way of thinking about this is in the notion of how we all grow up learning language, and we learn in terms of synonyms and antonyms. But if we look around us, and if we look even at the discussion here today, it is our brain's ability to set aside opposites which becomes absolutely at the heart of so many ways in which we think about the world. And in particularly, we talk about morality, because obviously we have morality on one side and we have immorality on the other side. We have good versus evil. And in the context of many other ways of which our brain begins to order and organize the world around us, we can think about religious ideas and religious concepts. The big opposite there is how we as human beings, as very finite, mortal, and very limited in what our capabilities are, can have any kind of interaction to something which is universal, or in the context of a particular religious tradition, a God that may be omniscient, all-powerful, eternal. How do we have a relationship to that? These are opposites that we have to figure out a way of working ourselves through. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is that the brain really does struggle with that. The brain likes the opposites on one hand because it makes it very clear in terms of how we're going to evaluate these different issues. But unfortunately, the brain also has to recognize that the world is not as black and white as it likes to think it is. And therefore, we have to deal with a lot of the gray issues. And how do we begin to think about that? And how do we allow this binary function of the brain to begin to address those kinds of topics and those kinds of issues? It's not easy for us to do. And yet somehow our brain keeps striving to do that. So we sometimes have to figure out a way of binding or bringing together these different opposites. And what's particularly interesting, I think, is that in particular spiritual traditions, where there are specific holistic kinds of experiences that people have, mystical experiences, one of the interesting phenomena there is that these opposites tend to go away. And in fact, in some of the mystical literature of a lot of the world's traditions, we can hear this kind of bringing together of good and evil. In fact, to some degree, good and evil become one and the same in a mystical perspective. It's a way of binding these ideas together, and it helps us to make more sense out of that in that particular context. For those of us who haven't had a mystical experience, we're still left with that struggle of trying to figure out, so how does this good and this evil come together? How do we understand that? Why do bad things happen? And why do bad things happen to good people? So these are the kinds of particular problems that we may have to face when we're looking at how the mind and the brain wraps itself around ethical and moral questions. Other cognitive functions which I think are also very interesting in terms of how we start to think about where the ethics and moral ideas and concepts come from within our own mind, for example, is our ability to think about things quantitatively. And by that, in this particular context, I don't necessarily mean mathematics, although we could certainly talk about that as well. But by quantitative, what I mean is that we do have an ability to assess greater than or less than. And therefore, we begin to think about moral questions as to, is it better than or worse than or greater than or less than? And how do numbers actually come into play? One of the classic examples I thought about in this context is that most of us, if we were walking along the street and we see a quarter on the street, we bend down, we pick it up, put it in your pocket. You see $5 sitting on the street, you bend down, you put it in your pocket. You see a wallet in the street that's got $10,000 in it. Now you might start, even if there's no identification, usually you probably aren't going to just put that in your pocket. You're going to start to think about, well, gee, somebody really lost a lot of money here. I need to think about this. I need to see if I can figure out who might have lost this. Maybe you turn that wallet into the police. So why is that the case? Why is it that we will deal with $5 in a different way than we'll deal with $1,000 or $10,000? So quantification becomes an important aspect when we start to think about our moral reasoning and the ways in which we assess different things. Okay, one of the classic moral dilemmas is the trolley dilemma. Probably somebody will talk about that in a little bit more detail, but basically it's kind of matching up one life versus 5 lives. And we have a tendency to put more emphasis on 5 lives versus 1. But then there are many other factors that come into play, because what if that 1 is your child or your parent or your spouse? Then suddenly that 1 becomes more valuable than the 5. And we begin to think about the ways in which we blend these different issues and these different quantitative elements together to help us in figuring out what we think is moral and what we think is immoral. We can think about ways of reducing ideas, and we already heard Dr. Giordano say in introducing me this idea of, should we reduce all of this to how the brain works? When I say that we can look at cognitive processes and causal reasoning and abstract processes, we're looking at it kind of from the brain up. So how does the brain actually help us to think and create moral ideas? On the other hand, we may need to step back and say, well, but can we really reduce all of this? Is this completely possible? Because as I mentioned a few minutes ago, when somebody has a mystical experience, they have a very different perspective on the material world. Suddenly the material world looks a lot less important to them. Now, as a scientist, that's a little hard to swallow, because we want to say, okay, the material world is what we have the ability to measure and look at and say something about. It's far harder for us to be able to say something about whatever a mystical, spiritual, supernatural realm might be. And therefore, as a scientist, that is a much more difficult issue for me to think about and for many of us here to think about. But I think in the context of morality, we have to at least acknowledge that other individuals look at this from a very different perspective and look at it from a non-reductive perspective. In fact, many of them look at it from a holistic perspective. And again, this is another process that the brain has the ability to do, which is to look at the large picture. And as you heard earlier, we do need to think about both the nature of the parts as well as the nature of the whole, and trying to do both at the same time is often very difficult. And as somebody in the field of neuroscience, it's always been amazing to me to see sometimes, people get so involved in what's going on in that one little area of the brain, the amygdala, let's say, and they study that and they do all these things, and you say, well, what about the frontal lobe? And they kind of look at you like, well, where's the frontal lobe? So I think it's important for us to always keep in mind the nature of both of those different processes, both a way of being reductive as well as a way of looking at things holistically. Emotions, of course, as you heard in Dr. Pfaff's lecture, are absolutely crucial in helping us to look at what is moral and what is not moral. Our aggressive feelings, our feelings of fear, our feelings of positive emotions, things that make us feel love and joy and happiness. These are all ways in which we begin to evaluate moral concepts. We tend to evaluate morality that makes us feel, or questions that make us feel poorly, make us feel upset, make us feel guilty, ashamed, embarrassed, as meaning that we did something that is immoral. And when things make us feel positive and they make us feel good and they make us feel like we've done something good for the world, then that makes us feel like we're doing something moral. So we look to our emotions to help us to assess where something is in the context of our moral spectrum. And therefore, we not only use it to help us to understand our moral ideas and to evaluate them, but we also use them to defend our moral ideas. And it's sometimes fascinating that in the defense of our own morality, we sometimes get awfully aggressive. And sometimes we also begin to act immoral in trying to defend our beliefs, whether it's our religious beliefs, political beliefs, or our moral beliefs. So we have to watch out for this dichotomy as well. And when we also talk about morality, we're talking about our brain's ability to think about social consensus. We are influenced by our genes and we are influenced by our environment. And when we talk about our environment, we're talking primarily about other people. And where does our morality begin? Well, it begins with our parents. In most cases, they're the ones who tell us what's right and what's wrong in the world. They tell us how to behave. And then it turns to our peers and our colleagues. And therefore, our group consensus, the ways in which we think about our morality, is heavily weighted and influenced by the people around us and the ways in which we think. And one little very cute study that I came across at one point brought people into a room and showed them these different lines, and they said, I want you to tell me which of the lines A, B, and C is the same length as X. Seems like a pretty straightforward question. And when they asked people, if they put another person into the room with the test subject who was told to say it's C instead of B, you could get about 15% of people to change their answer. And the more people you put into the room that say, yes, it's C, the more people will change their answer. So we are clearly heavily influenced by the ways in which other people around us are thinking and feeling. And therefore, this has an influence on our cognitive processes, all those cognitive processes I just talked about, very important in terms of how we are influenced from the perspective of people who are around us. Now, I want to turn to the topic of inclusivity and exclusivity, because this is something that has come up a lot in my research of religious and spiritual practices. When people engage in a practice like meditation, what happens is that people feel that sense of connectedness. They sometimes even they describe a loss of the sense of self, a blurring of the boundary between themselves and others, and they feel this sense of inclusiveness between themselves and the world, or themselves and God, depending on their particular perspective. Now, what's interesting in that context is that we're all kind of built and born with this sense of kind of us versus them mentality, or in-group, out-group kind of mentality. And we actually pick this up very quickly, very easily, and to some degree, very negatively. So if I just separated this room into two groups, even randomly, after a while, you'd think that your group was better than the other group, and you'd think that the ideas or whatever task I gave you to do would be better in your group than the other group. Now, why should that be? Well, because that's the group that you're part of. So you have this sense of inclusivity, and you're now going to work very well with the people in your group, but you are going to have a different kind of perspective for the people who are in the out group. So we have a tendency to act far more morally within the members of our own group. Even when we talk, as Dr. Pfaff was mentioning with the golden rule, we tend to apply that certainly far more to the people who are immediately within our group than those people who may be outside of our group. Now, rituals, which come in many different forms and certainly are very involved in our religious and spiritual practices, are, I think, a morally neutral technology in many ways and have a very deep influence on the human brain. Most rituals have a very rhythmic element to it and help a person to wrap their being, their mind, their brain around a particular idea or set of ideas. But that means that if you engage in a ritual that has a very positive perspective on the world, or a very positive sense of inclusivity, then you're probably going to wind up with a very positive feeling towards the other people that are included in that ritual, or whatever that ritual is directed at. On the other hand, if your ritual is very negative, and it's us versus them, and it fosters the us versus them mentality, then it can actually cause an increase in intergroup aggression. So you can now feel that it's so justified, perhaps, to go out and be aggressive against a group that you don't agree with, that doesn't believe in your beliefs. Because after all, if they don't believe in your beliefs, your religious, spiritual, political beliefs, moral beliefs, then in some ways, sometimes the brain almost thinks that they're not even part of your reality. And if they're not really part of your reality, well, then it's fine to do immoral things to them because it doesn't really apply. So I think that this becomes a very important element when we think about the rituals that we try to engage in, and how do we ultimately decide on the kinds of rituals and the kinds of practices that we should strive for or look towards to help us rather than to hurt us in our pursuit of some type of universal morality. Now, I just wanted to show a couple of our brain scan slides. these are images that we've taken over the years looking at different types of practices. The first two are meditation studies, and the second two are prayer studies. And a couple of just very brief things in making sure we don't run out of time here. If we look at these are what are called SPECT scans. They're looking at blood flow in the brain. The red areas are the most active, followed by the yellow, and then the blue and the black. If you look towards the top, I don't know if we have a pointer here. Oh, here. If you look towards the top of the scan here, this is where the frontal lobes are, which are a very important part of the cortex and very important part of helping us to focus our mind, to focus our attention on a lot of these different ideas and questions. And what happens is that when people engage in a practice of meditation, they actually turn on this frontal part of the brain. And to pick up on some of what Dr. Pfaff was talking about, it's part of that interaction between the cortex, the frontal lobes, and the amygdala and the thalamus that actually help to modulate our feelings of aggression, our responses to the world. And what we've been showing is that when people engage in a deep practice of meditation, that they activate this part of the brain. This part is now more red here and here than what you see in the baseline state. So when they're engaged in meditation, they activate these parts of the brain to a far greater extent. Another area of the brain that I've euphemistically called here the orientation area, this is part of the brain called the parietal lobe. So this is located towards the back part of the brain. And if you look at the baseline state, when the person's just kind of resting quietly, it's pretty equal on both sides and fairly comparable to the front part of the brain. When a person is in meditation, there is a substantial drop of activity in this area. Now, the reason that I call this the orientation area is that one of its functions is to take a lot of our sensory information and to try to create for us a sense of orientation, a sense of ourself in the context of the world. And isn't it interesting that we see a drop of activity in here? Does that have something to do with our loss of the sense of self, our sense of interconnectedness with other things in the world, or with God? So these are the kinds of changes that we can observe and begin to speculate as to what that actually means from the perspective of how we actually think about the world and we think about ourselves. This is a study of prayer where, again, we see activation in the frontal lobe. It's much more red here when they're concentrating on the prayer compared to what we see in the baseline state. Now, interestingly, they also activated this area, which is the lower or inferior part of the parietal lobe, which is very involved in a lot of those abstract thought processes. And of course, prayer is a verbal practice, so not surprising that there is a substantial increase of activity in this area as they contemplate these abstract ideas. But they also decrease the activity in this parietal area, in this orientation part of the brain, compared to what you see here. It's much more red here compared to here. So we can look at how different practices start to affect our brain, think about the subjective experiences that people have, and then perhaps in a practical way try to figure out what are the types of practices that might best foster compassionate, moral ways of thinking about things. So again, inclusivity and exclusivity have to do a lot with our sense of ourself and the way in which we perceive that self. This extends all the way from ourself to the family, community, state, country, and then ultimately humanity as a whole. Unfortunately, humanity is at the end of that list. So it takes a while before we get to that experience of inclusivity of all of humanity, which is what we might ultimately need to strive for if we're going to look for some kind of universal morality. Of course, ultimately, as I mentioned, when there is a conflict of these beliefs, when there is a lack of a feeling of inclusiveness, when there's a feeling of exclusiveness, this is where aggression begins to occur. And the question is, can we turn that around? Can we try to find a way of fostering compassion and encouraging a greater sense of inclusivity? Now, we can then ask whether, as I mentioned, whether or not neuroscience can help us in this regard. Can we find the practices that Dr. Pfaff was talking about? I'm sure some of the other speakers later today will talk about. Can we better understand how different practices that foster compassion, foster morality, where these exist, where they are involving different parts of the brain, and can we begin to think about trying to figure out and tailor different practices to help people engage in more compassionate, more moral behavior? Because after all, we all are having a swirl of these cognitive processes, these emotions within us. We have this binary process, and we are always, all of us have this aggressive and compassionate side within us. And I think that that's really important. What most studies have shown, that we almost can make anyone immoral if we put them into the right conditions. And if you think about some of the early work that was done out in California with the prisoners study, where they made certain people prisoners and certain people guards, well, they had to stop that study early because the people who were selected as guards, they were all getting ready to almost kill each other, even though these were just otherwise regular people. So anybody can be made to be immoral. And of course, all of us have this compassionate side within us. And I think, it's interesting to think about this even from an evolutionary perspective, because we really need both sides. You need that aggressive behavior. I've often thought about whether or not the key evolutionary trait that human beings have has been aggressive behavior, because that is in part what has enabled us to go out and to be aggressive against other species, other human species and so forth, that have made us and brought us to where we are today. On the other hand, you have to have at least a substantial enough of compassion in order to be able to maintain your groups, your families, your societies. And I think this is beautifully described in what I like the story of the Tale of Two Wolves. There's different versions of this, but this has become one of my favorite stories. My version of it is an American Indian little boy was having a fight with one of his friends. His friend stole something of him, and he runs to his grandfather and he says, grandfather, I'm really conflicted here. On one hand, I want to go and beat this kid up because he stole my toy. On the other hand, I feel like I should forgive him. And the grandfather looks at him and he says, well, we all have these two wolves within ourselves. We have this compassionate, forgiving side of ourselves, and we have this aggressive, vengeful side of ourselves. And the little boy thought about that and he said, well, but how do you know? And the grandfather says to him, well, these wolves are always fighting it out inside of you. And the little boy looks at him and he says, well, but how do you know which wolf will win? And the grandfather looks at him and he says, well, it is the wolf that you feed that will win. So the idea here, I think, is that we ultimately have to learn ways in which we can feed that compassionate side of ourselves, the compassionate parts of our brain. And whether we ultimately turn to meditation techniques, and obviously I'm partially biased because that's one of the things that I study a lot, or other approaches to forgiveness and compassion, we can look at these types of techniques as ways of helping us to help to reduce our feelings of aggression, our feelings of fear, anxiety, and so forth. It may be that this can help us to direct our compassionate feelings outwardly. And part of what comes from these practices, the ritual practices that we have, is this feeling of inclusivity, because ultimately what I think we need to do is to take these kinds of practices and enable a feeling of unification, a feeling of inclusivity of not just our local group, but a larger group, the country, the world as a whole, the universe perhaps. And in doing so, that I think is a way of ultimately finding the kinds of practices that will work for each one of us. And I think that's also important to think about how we might need to tailor these to each individual to ultimately provide a much more compassionate, inclusive, and beneficial way in which we all can think about ourselves, the morals that we hold, and the ways in which we explore and engage the world in that kind of moral and ethical way. So I think that's my last slide. Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to your questions later.